What's up, YouTube? So today we're going to start about steering, show you the upgrades I did, how I'm going to prevent it from breaking, how it all goes together. It's part of my trac 60 upgrade and my 3-link and all my new suspension. So I built a bunch of parts and we're going to walk you through exactly all the reasons I did what I did, and hopefully it turns out to be a good steering system. The first thing I want to walk you through is some of the components I'm using on my steering system. This was the stock Dynatrac steering arm that came on the housing, the bare housing that I bought. And researching on the internet, those things were not the best. Apparently what would happen is they would tend to break these 3 bolts off here. So when you read on the internet, people that have hardcore wheeling, you know, this thing would start to rock back and forth and would snap those studs off. People were having problems with that. So I made this, what I'll call different heavy-duty steering arm. There's other ways you can fix it. A lot of people buy completely new knuckles. That was a little pricey for me, so we cut this out on a friend's water jet, and I'm gonna put it together in such a way that it kind of reinforces it out here. And I readjusted where the steering hole goes so that I can get a full lock-to-lock turn, get a little tighter turning radius, and I'll show you all that as it goes together. Other important component I got here is my my steering arm. You see it's got a little bend. That bend goes down on this end over here. And the other important component, and this is one of the few things I kept from my old one, is that red guy up there. That's a Genrite twisted twisted Pitman arm, and that guy is pretty cool. It allows you a little more travel because that's the twisted part of it, and we'll show you how that works. And it's also pretty heavy duty, so like that component. It also moves the steering arm way up. So some of the cool things about this is, one, as this axle travels up, a normal TJ steering arm is like down here, and I could never move this axle as far forward if I didn't have this. So it moves it up. You have to put a body lift on it a little bit, again, clear some room in there for it. But that thing has served me well, and those are the main components of the steering, and we'll put those together and we'll show you how they work. Okay, so first thing I did is I've hooked my steering arm up here, and then I just kind of let it hang down. And I want to show you something. So what this tells you is that this eventually binds up. So as this drops down, eventually you get a point of binding. Now, depending on how much travel you have at this end, when you're at full flex and that thing's at full droop, one of the things that can happen is this: if it binds up here, we'll start wrenching and twisting your steering box, and it will break your sector shaft, or it will rip your steering box off the frame. I've had both of those problems happen to me in the past. So, you know, one of the things I really carefully checked was that at full droop, when that axle is all the way down, I do not have any binding at this end, and we're going to check the same at that end. You'll see here there's a little bend, and that little bend is there because I did have some binding at the bottom end at full droop, and I had to kind of twist it a little bit to allow that heim joint enough flex to ensure I didn't bind up and put torque on this. So one of the things you're worried about is this twisting. The other thing you're going to end up worrying about is whether it's jamming back and forth, and we'll talk about that a little later. Okay, so the steering arm is on. Noticed I used those Dana 44 style 9/16 studs. You buy those standard kits. Got it there. Now the way I reinforced this is, if you look at it, down here is my tie rod. Here is the knuckle connection, and you notice I ran a 3/4 bolt through my tie rod, which still has some bend in it, through this spacer, and then I threaded it into this block, so it's threaded inside here, and then I put a safety nut on top. Now that's where the tie rod goes from one side to the other to make it turn. And additionally, now I've got my steering hooked up, and you can see that this this joint right here is a little bit curved down, and that's because as you get to full droop, this kind of rolls up, and when it rolls up, I had to put that bend in there to get to keep this end from binding. So I know the other end doesn't bind, I know this end doesn't bind. And now there's another cool thing. You might be going like, man, I could have hooked my steering up in sort of a double shear configuration by moving it way out here, but I didn't do that for a specific reason. The steering is back here. So the reason this bolt is here is to line this up, tie this together, and make this whole steering assembly stronger. The reason the steering is attached here is because when you attach the steering at this point, when you use a TJ steering box, you get the full range of steering available from this axle. I'll show you why that is. So I'm going to come over here, and I'm going to show you a little, well, it's going to be tough to see. So when you look down in here, let's get in here, this right here, there's a little gap right there. That little gap is where the knuckle stop hits. And so what you want to have happen is you want your steering to stop at full lock right where that hits. And you can see there's just a tiny gap in there. And then I'm going to go roll the steering wheel to the other side. So now we're going to go full lock the other way. And we're going to look at the steering on the other side. See if we can get in there and get a good view with our camera. So if you look down in there, you can see the steering stop right here, and it's also just got a tiny little gap. And what that means is my steering is now what I'll call bulletproofed. And the reason I say that is this is, one, I have the maximum amount of left and right steering you can get. And that's really important. The other thing that's important, you know, and I guess I can't overemphasize, being able to turn when you're four-wheeling is super critical. So I'm getting the maximum amount of steering. So as you look at it, if I had put the steering out here, when I was at full lock, I'd have a big gap there. So imagine you're four-wheeling along, you're taking a tight turn, and you've got that little gap there, and your front tire, bam, it hits a rock and it wrenches that front tire further towards the driver. That's going to transmit a force through this steering rod. It's going to get transmitted up into that steering box, and that steering box is going to get flexed. And so what you don't want to have happen is, as you're going through the rocks and hitting stuff at full lock, to transmit a bunch of force along this steering arm back and forth into that steering box area. And I'll show you what I lost a couple steering boxes, I think because my steering wasn't designed right the first time. So you can see on my Jeep, I've got this heavily reinforced sort of custom built steering plate that I put on. We did that a couple years back when I ripped the steering box off on the Rubicon. Now it's plated on both sides, sleeved through, and the bolts are on. So the steering box is stronger, but you still don't want to be putting those forces on it. So by doing it this way, and what I'll end up doing is down here, I'll put a little tack weld right there so that I can get that steering stop and the steering to stop at exactly the same spot. But I have about a 1/16 of an inch there, so that's a good thing. I think having all your steering lined up, getting the maximum amount of steering out of your vehicle, you know, and that took a lot of time and measurement and getting this built right. And I'll say, if somebody thinks this is cool and wants me to help build something like this, I can certainly walk you through it or help you out. I mean, I thought that was a fun engineering project. This one also is threaded in here with the cap thread on it, and that's where my steering attaches on the bottom. I like the way the steering itself is tucked up in here and protected from, you can hit stuff here, but you won't break that steering arm. So spent a lot of time getting my steering what I would consider right, and I'm pretty happy with the results and the good steering I'm going to get out of it, and we'll see how it performs on the trail. Okay, so now I'm starting to work on my steering. I'm going to show you some of the options I have. Number of different ways you can set up your steering. You can go high steer, and you can mount your steering tie rod above, and it's a popular thing. I'll show you in a minute why I'm not going to do that. So this is your tie rod. You can mount your steering arm, your pitman arm that goes to the steering box here. And I had this little notch kept to the old one. And you know, when that happens, what happens when you do that, as you can see, unless I were to bend this way down and kind of dip it and make a curve bend in it, prefer to have it straight. I'm not going to have much up travel here before this arm extended through here is going to hit stuff. So I'll show you another, on the other side, I'll show you that this, when you mount this above the top of the knuckle on this Dynatrac knuckle, what happens is this starts to come up. As you come up, it starts to hit the steering arm, even though the steering arm is raised way up. So for a number of reasons, in the trade-off of things, you know, yeah, you want to get your steering stuff out of the way, but you don't want to do it at the expense of losing a good portion of your up travel, so that you can have a suspension that fully flexes up and down without going really super high on your lift. You know, I could jack this thing way down, and you know, then your center of gravity gets really high, and your rollover potential gets to be a lot higher. So, you know, so what I'm going to do is I've kind of mocked this up. I'm actually going to end up flipping this over, putting it under, show you another view, and then I have two choices. I could mount, you know, the arm that goes to the steering box here. Because I'm mounting this under, I could come underneath and mount this up here, and it would be a little bit lower. Be nice, give me some more up travel. There's another kind of steering system that Chevy used, where this tie rod here has a hole in it here, and depending on how much room you have or how you set it up, you can either mount your steering and call it Y-link steering here, or in some cases I've seen guys build custom kits where they mount the Y-link steering here, and that brings it down even lower. So if I did a Y-link steering here, I'd be here, way down here, but if I actually take this out and move it under here, now my Y-link steering is way down here, and I have lots of room for up travel. You know, I can see that steering can go way up before it starts to hit stuff. So those are the sort of trade-offs that we look at, and I'll start to show you some of the interference points. Obviously, one of them is right here, if you have this super high steering. Okay, so having decided that I'm going to go ahead and mount my steering on the bottom. So I haven't decided I'm mounting my steering from the bottom. Now I want to make sure my tie rod is going to clear my differential cover from lock to lock. So here I am. Set that up and go up under here. And look at this bad boy. And I got a ton of clearance here. That's great. And I can turn it all the way. So I can go to probably almost 1.5 inches, 2 inch, which is probably what I'm going to do. Dom, and it's still relatively high. I mean, about stock height. Now I have my steering arms mocked up in the position where I'd have this under and this under, then I can steer it. I'm going to turn the wheel, and you can see it. I'll show you a couple of things that are important. Right here, this piece of metal contacts that piece of metal. That's your steering lock. That's your maximum turning. You can turn because physically the knuckle won't let it go any further. You have one of those on either side. You want your steering to be able to go, essentially, well, I may not be able to do it just pushing it. I have to go turn the wheel from lock to lock. So what I did was I mocked this up, and I went in there and turned it, and it does go lock to lock. So I'll show you that. Okay. In this case, the steering is locked up and it's on the bump. It's on the metal-to-metal stop on the driver's side. I'm going to check the other side. Come in here and take a look, and I'm metal to metal on this side. So yeah, so I know I can get there. Now, interestingly, that feels about exactly where I get maximum turning out of my steering. If I were to go out to here, or I were to go and, you know, you had one of those high steer setups, one of the trade-offs is that that arm might not get all the way full lock to lock, and you might lose a little bit of that last little bit of steering that you would like to have in your system. And I suspect that Dynatrac built this custom top arm with the hole where it is strictly for that reason, so that you could get maximum turning, which means as far as these knuckles will turn, allow you to turn out of a sort of stock Jeep steering box, which makes a lot of sense. If you go a little bit longer, then you lose a little bit of steering. Another one of those trade-offs. I've seen a lot of guys that, you know, they have the hole here and here lined up, and they use really cool double shear. I'm not going to do that. I'm going to stick with this setup right here, because I think it gives me the I consider steering, being able to really steer tightly in the rocks, much more important than the little bit of strength you'd gain. And let's face it, these kind of parts are cheap and you can carry them with you. So if you break one, no big deal. So now, I've still got other things to check. A couple other reasons, things I'll need to check eventually. And one of them is, as this articulates, these joints can only go up and down so far. So I'm going to have to cycle my suspension and make sure that when I do that, that these joints don't bind. I had that happen to me once before. I had a suspension that would droop so far that you would overextend this, and it was breaking my steering system. I'll demonstrate that a little later in the video. So it's a little bit difficult to see in this video. So here's my steering arm, and here's my track bar. Now when you look at it, I'm going to measure this. It looks like the center of the steering arm is just about, maybe pretty close to the same height. I mean, it might be a ½ inch lower. So what that tells you is where the bolt on the other end needs to go. For it to be parallel, this and this need to be, you know, this hole here at this end is going to be on the other end at the same length, about a ½ inch down or so, and that'll make them parallel. Now I've already measured this. It's about 36 inches, so I'm going to need a bar here that goes 36 inches and comes down there, and that's how you get this end. So now I've come back to the other side, and I'm looking at, okay, so I need to be about a ½ inch higher than right here, which means my track bar is going to be somewhere over in here, you know, to be 36 inches long. It's, you know, it's about 5 or 6 inches back, but I know the distance. And so now I got to look at what interference problems am I going to have with a track bar. It's about here. So I'm going to go grab the bracket I was thinking about using for the track bar, and we'll see if it'll fit in there. So today I've finished mocking up my steering and my track bar. So, you know, you can see I got my steering below, mounted my sort of dummy track bar down here using a muffler clamp with a bolt drilled through it. Went around on the other side, mocked it up. If you can see up in there, it goes up and over the differential. Look in there, see how it follows it up there and over. And from this side you can see kind of how it goes up, and got it out of the way of the steering arm. Little tiny bit of clearance there, and a little bit of clearance over the top. So I think I'm good. I'm just about to the point where I'm ready to pull it off the jack stands and start cycling the suspension. What I'll do is I'll take the shocks completely off, or yeah, I'll probably just take them completely off and cycle that thing. I'm going to pull my bump stops out and just see how far up I can get and use that to next set my bump stop height on both sides so I can make sure that I get maximum travel out of it. From there, once I have my max up travel, then I'll start looking at where to attach my shocks for real, like whether they're a little high right now and on top of the axle. I might move them down or up depending on where I need to put them to get the maximum travel out of those guys. And so that's that for the latest in the Dana 60 project. Alright, so here I am, I'm working on my knuckles and the installation of my steering. Wanted to talk a little bit about a couple of things that are important in steering. First is strength, and the reason I talk about strength is when you design and you go through building your own steering system, what you really want to do is really think through where are your weak points going to be. Now, I'm using this nice 1/4 inch, 1 inch diameter Dom tubing from the steering link down, and that's not going to be the wink link or the joints on the end of it. One of the things I've seen people do that I think creates an unnecessary weak spot and a dangerous weak spot is this is a 7/8 drill. Now you could take, if you wanted to use like 1-ton tie rod ends and drill out your knuckle with this big 7/8 drill and drop that nice spacer in, or you can cone it out, which would be a better idea. But those little drop-in flip your bracket spacer kits, I don't like those. The reason is because this metal here, you don't want this to be your weak point. You don't want this to break off or to snap here or here and then have this fall off, then your whole tie rod comes off. I had that happen to me in my old 66 CJ5A. I had a knuckle break right here, and this came off, and my right tire went off to the right side, and I was doing about 50 miles an hour down the road when it happened, and I'm lucky to still be here today. So I'm pretty cautious. So instead of drilling out a huge 7/8 hole, what I did was I drilled out this by about a 64th of an inch so I could tap it with a 3/4 thread, coarse thread. So I'm going to go ahead and finish tapping this hole, and it was a weird drill size. Got that drill size, drilled this out just as little as I could, and I'm going to go ahead and finish tapping it. I was most of the way done already. And okay, here we go. Let's finish tapping this out. Okay, so now I'm going to show you how it goes on. I'm using these offset heim joints, and one of the reasons you tap this is because if you just drilled a straight hole and put a bolt on top, you might eventually get some wobble in there, and if you drive it on the street a lot, you might start to get some death wobble. Didn't want that to happen. Make sure you have safety washers. Safety washers make sure that if your heim ever busts out, it won't come over the head of the bolt. Notice that the washer's so big that even if the inside ball of the heim breaks out, still isn't going to let go. So you put your safety washer in, and I'll do this when it's installed on the tie rod. Then you thread your bolt in. Okay. Okay, I haven't really tightened that down, but just showing you what I'm doing. So I'm going to thread that in from the bottom, and then I'm going to put one of these one-time only lock nuts when you tighten these down. So I'm going to have it threaded through here. What happens when you do that is you get no play right here, and you haven't weakened this part. Now, a lot of people would say, hey, go over the top. I'll explain later why I use these offsets, and really I can explain that now. It's just so I can fit some, I'm going to have some hydraulic assist steering in here later, and I need extra room away from that axle. I want to mount it in a safe place. And the other reason is I want my steering lower because that'll allow me to have more up travel. Which is important. So that's kind of what I did on my steering. Did the threading so you get the nice tight fit just like you would if you used a tapered ball joint, but you get the strength of a heim joint. And I've done the other side, so now I'm just going to throw my tie rod on and thank Rough Stuff Specialties and some of the other companies that gave me these nice offset Heim style tie rod ends. These things are pretty cool. Okay, so now I've got my tie rod mocked up, and you see how much clearance I have from the diff. So this tie rod's pretty far out, you know, thanks to these spaced out Heim joints, which are really cool. The next thing you want to think about is, okay, here's where my steering arm is going to come down, and there's going to be an arm here, and it's going to be about in there. So that keeps that generally out of the way. And then my track bar is going to be somewhere down in here, maybe a little higher. So what I want to do now is take my dummy mocked up track bar and start thinking about what I want to do for my future hydraulic steering. And you notice I have this huge gap in here, even at full lock and out to here. So what I think is that ultimately, if I put my track bar here, I'm going to have room in here with this space to put a nice hydraulic ram to assist my steering, and probably attach it here to my tie rod. Now, of course, I'm putting the tie rod out there, but let's face it, weak spots, when you have this heavy a tie rod, the way I've connected these tie rod ends, you know, the weak spots in this are going to be probably these 3 bolts that hold this arm on, and I'm going to have to build a special bracket. I'll talk about that later. The other weak spot is going to be up on my steering box. I'll show you another thing that I'm doing, I got to make sure of, is I go ahead and I lift this all the way up, and I can check this for droop. So what I want to make sure that doesn't happen is that when you'll see a stock steering box, is that this arm comes way down here and has lots of travel. I've had some on a previous Jeep. I had one that would bind up there, and it would come down to about here. Then when my suspension would go to full droop, it would twist on that arm, and I ended up breaking sector shafts, and I ended up breaking my steering box. I kept wondering, why am I breaking all these steering components? And it was because I hadn't considered how much leverage this had when it went to full droop. Now, I've checked mine, and I end up getting about right here, you know, when I get all the way down and I get my shocks adjusted. But I got plenty here. Now I got to make sure with the Heim joint up there, I'm going to use a high misalignment Heim joint down here, and I'll be able to have plenty of travel up and down. Now, when you're building a suspension, you got to make sure that things like this don't happen, that you have plenty of travel. The other thing I'm doing is, on my old Dana 44, I put the steering, of course, everyone wants high steer, so I put it way up high, and I ended up having to drill this thing because it would come up into here when you compress your suspension. On this one, because I'm going underneath, it comes to about there. What that's going to allow me to do is move these back on the back side and get a couple more inches, maybe 1.5 inches more of up travel on these shocks. And that's sort of what the people start talking about when they say low center of gravity build. And that's a build where you're trying to get as much up travel as you can, keep that Jeep low, and really all these little extra inches that you can gain by making things like your steering a little bit lower, keeping your track bar down and out of the way. You know, even if you have to move your tie rod down, if you build things strong, that's not going to be a problem, and you end up with a suspension that allows your Jeep to be a little more stable, and you can run bigger tires with that lower center of gravity stance, and that's kind of what I'm shooting for on this build.